Hi, Chelsea.
Hey Chris, how you doing?
Good. Thank you. That was great. Appreciate it. We'll give folks a couple minutes to catch up here, at least a minute. Um, I love a good refactoring. I love the tale of it. It's just it seems so commonsensical.
Mm-hmm.
What I want to encourage people to do, I've got a couple questions queued up, but if there are other questions, please put them in the chat here, or if you're feeling less shy, hop on camera and let us see your face. But briefly, just some things that came to mind. So I'm going to ask you a true or false question.
Totally.
True or false? Too much time is spent on requirements gathering.
Oh, so this is a very interesting question because, I'll give the short version. I'll try to give the short version because I like this question a lot. But there's these sort of two competing philosophies of software design, right? One of them is waterfall, very popular in the 80s and 90s. Big enterprise companies a lot of times use waterfall. This is delineating all the requirements down to the error messages up front and not moving on the software at all until you have all of those requirements gathered. In the 90s, we got the Agile Manifesto, and this idea of Agile and extreme programming kind of popped up as a foil to the waterfall mechanism of software development.
Mm-hmm.
The way that Agile works is you do very, very little planning up front. You start writing the code, and you make all of your decisions during software development at what is called the last responsible moment. So the last responsible moment meaning that if you've already done some of the development work, theoretically, you already have some practical experience from which to draw conclusions about how to make future decisions. Now, I think that both of these approaches, so in general, you'll hear like Agile people talk about how waterfall is terrible, and waterfall people will tell you that Agile people don't make decisions properly. And I think that we see with both approaches, a lot of our problems come from a very similar place. And I think that that place is a focus on getting functionality kind of like out the door and rewarding a very specific type of feature rather than rewarding all the different types of features that we were talking about in that talk. And so, if waterfall worked all the time, then we wouldn't be using Agile to rewrite all the stuff that got written with waterfall. But at this point, Agile's been around long enough that we're starting to do ground up rewrites of stuff that was written with Agile too. And so I think there is a case to be made for leave some decisions for the last responsible moment. But I also think there's a case to be made for don't do literally zero planning ahead of your software. I think instead it's valuable. So the exercise that I've started doing with some of the teams that I work with is we figure out a lot of our major requirements. We break down those requirements, determine how much information we need to gather about those. And then we have sort of a track of stuff that we're ready to write code on, stuff that we need to continue gathering information on. And we're consciously gathering that information over time. And we also talk about risks ahead of time. Ahead of the project, we talk about technical risks that we're gonna deal with and how likely they are, how catastrophic they'd be if they happened, how likely they are to go uncaught. So we identify those big risks and we figure out mitigation strategies up front. So when we go into the project, we don't know everything yet, but we have three things. We have a list of stuff we're ready to move on. We have a list of additional information we need to gather to move on more stuff. And we have a list of risks that we might otherwise have missed if we didn't explicitly focus on them. And I find that is a helpful, it may not be the answer for every team, but I find that on teams I've worked with, it's a really helpful balance between upfront planning and not getting mired in upfront planning.
Right.
Yeah.
Just don't get caught up in all the dogma. And there you go. You're going back to that number 3 again.
Yeah.
I don't know. So Michelle asks, when does a refactor get so big that it essentially becomes a rewrite? And is that a danger sign of some kind?
Sure. So the thing about rewrites is that I think, well, let me give you some background on this. So my dad, I'm a software engineer, which is not exactly the same thing. My dad was a mechanical engineer. He built tractors, designed tractors. And he and I don't agree on very many things. But one thing that I think he's right about that. I grew up kind of with him teaching me was that the vast majority of the time, it is worth the investment to attempt to fix the thing you already have, as opposed to building a new one. And unfortunately, on software engineering teams, I think that the inclination is often towards the opposite. And I think that happens for a couple different reasons. One of the big ones is churn. So you have a system that's hard to maintain. There are a couple reasons why software can be hard to maintain. We generally think of software as being hard to maintain because the code is bad. I don't think that that's necessarily the case most of the time. Honestly, I think the vast majority of code is like not that terrible that I've seen in my career. However, on those legacy systems that developers don't want to maintain, there is something else at play, which is loss of context. So many times I've joined a team and they've been like, this legacy code is absolutely terrible. We need to rewrite it from scratch. It would require so many refactors that it's not even worth it, yada, yada, yada. And I go in the code. And honestly, the code is like, fine. The code is fine. But here's the issue, is that it's not particularly well documented, which in and of itself would be okay if the original developer were there. But the other thing that we're dealing with in the tech industry is churn. The original developers of the program are no longer available to ask questions. And then the new folks on the team don't have documentation to go off of. And the new folks on the team have not systematically built the skill of analyzing existing software to figure out how it works. So since the original writers didn't document it and the new developers aren't particularly well versed in how to figure it out, the code is labeled unmaintainable, even though the quality of the code is not the problem. And so I think a lot of times people mistake their unfamiliarity with the existing system for the inadequacy of the existing system. And it's almost never true in my experience. And here's the heuristic that I use to talk about why it's almost never true. By definition, if a piece of software has survived long enough that all the people who originally wrote it are no longer around, almost by definition, it's doing something right. Because software doesn't stick around that long unless it's doing something that's useful to people. I will try extremely hard to figure out what software is doing and maintain the existing software before I will spring for building a new thing. Because here's what happens when developers build a new thing. They're very excited because it's all greenfield, it's brand new, it's really small. Their ground speed is really high. And almost immediately, they get hype on that ground speed and they start going really fast. They're not documenting as they go. They start cutting corners with the testing. And the development practices that they're using to build this new thing aren't biting them yet because the software system isn't big and they're still here. But 15 years from now, that thing that they built to rewrite the other thing is going to get rewritten again because they didn't take precautions to prevent it from falling into the same state of context to disrepair that the original system had.
Got it.
So that's something I really caution developers on.
Great. Shivam asks, how often should one refactor code?
I think as often as you're running into maintainability issues with the code. I like to roll refactoring into the feature development that I'm working on. I find that if we make them separate, it's a little bit easier for the business to make the case for pushing the refactor down on the backlog. I'd rather include maintaining my code in the process of developing my code. And I think of refactoring as like part of my general cleanup, the same way that if I were doing a project in a workshop, I would always clean up my work area after I were done. If I continued to build stuff in my workshop and I were not doing any of that cleanup, the whole workshop would very quickly become unusable. So I think of refactoring as a cleanup step that's imperative for me to do after each project. Makes
sense. You mentioned also kind of how much are you willing to pay in terms of building on the financial model. And to me, anyway, it seemed like you were almost tiptoeing around technical debt. And it occurred to me that, is this something that you can use in terms of determining technical debt and what you want to pay off? Yeah. So technical debt's an interesting one because we talk a lot about technical debt, but I'm not sure that we have a good metric for technical debt. Nor a common understanding, probably. Right. And so when I'm talking about technical debt, what I like to do is I like to frame it in terms of maintenance load. So
Maintenance load refers to the amount of developer time and effort that your team is currently having to spend to maintain the existing feature set. Not adding anything, not making any progress, just keeping the existing thing up and running. So here's the thing about maintenance load is that, so it's measured in developer time, right? So I like to measure it in the amount of full-time development work that needs to be done. Suppose that your team is 5 people and it takes maybe 1 developer's worth full-time to maintain what's existing, and everybody else can focus on feature development. That's pretty good. That's not where most teams are at. A lot of times when I walk in and I start working with teams, so I have a consultancy and I help teams with this, I go in and the maintenance load of that software is at or above the number of developers who are on the team. So the developers are like not able to develop features at this point because they're so focused on maintaining the existing code. Or, and this is the dire case, they're constantly having outages and responding to pager requests, and that is a key sign that the maintenance load is higher than the number of developers that you have. Now, here's the other thing, is developers like building features. They don't like just having to prop up the same thing all the time. So even if your maintenance load is exactly the same as the number of developers that you have, eventually those developers are going to get burnt out because they're not doing anything that they feel like is enjoyable and meaningful to them, and they'll leave, and then you have churn. And when you have churn, you lose context. We get into that situation we were talking about before, where our existing code is not documented, people don't have the skills to figure it out, and so as a result, our maintenance load increases, our technical debt increases. It's really critical that we focus on keeping that maintenance load lower. So it kind of depends on your team, but I think that a good rule of thumb is take the number of people on your team. Imagine how much time they probably want to spend on meaningful work, which is adding features and removing features. Those are the 2 types of meaningful work. Say they want to spend, say you have 8 developers and you figure they want to spend 75% of their time doing that. In that case, you need to keep your maintenance load under 2 full-time developers. If it gets above that, you're starting to get into this situation where you're eating at your engineers' patience. They might think about leaving if it stays that way for too long. And then the maintenance load gets higher if they leave and they take context with them. Now, keeping it down that low can be a really tough thing to do. And that's why I think it is so important for teams to be extremely disciplined about keeping and maintaining the set of features that people are using that's useful. Because so many times the maintenance load gets bloated by features that have to be maintained that nobody is using.
No
because
one's
having
using
a feature is like not free, you have to keep maintaining it. And so that's why I categorize as meaningful work adding features and removing features, because adding features feels meaningful, but removing features, first of all, from a technical perspective is fun, and second of all, is fulfilling because you know that's code you no longer have to maintain.
Right. Thus the psychology. I like that. Any further advice on kind of selling the business on overall refactoring efforts? You kind of plotted some things out, but it seems very important aspect to, you have to go and get the justification for time spent.
Yeah, exactly. Well, one of the things that I think companies are getting hip to, I think tech companies have already kind of figured this out. I think the companies that are not specifically tech companies, but they have tech wings are starting to figure this out, is that they're competing for basically 2 things in the tech industry. One of them is access to capital. Now, insurance companies, banks maybe don't have to worry about that. The second one is access to tech talent. And even in non-tech sectors, companies that need to maintain tech teams have to compete with that, because folks, technologists, designers, product managers, engineers, etc., who are working in a tech team at one of those companies can also work at like tech companies. And so they're competing with tech companies on this. And they definitely have some advantages. We could talk about tech hiring in some future talk, but one of the things that is really critical is having a code base that is attractive for developers to work on, because this is something that developers are going to ask about. And in particular, as developers increase in seniority, they're going to be asking questions about this in the interview process. And as that, it's so competitive to get those kinds of developers. It can be really valuable to be able to have things to say about that. I also find that this metric that we were previously using, maintenance load, it does something very interesting in conversations with the business. Because a lot of times when we talk about tech debt, we don't have good numbers to help the business understand why it's important. And the closest we can get is, it's going to take 3 weeks for us to resolve this issue. And we need to take that 3 weeks because we need to. But we don't have any numbers around the benefits. And so the only number we're using with the business is the amount of time that in their minds they're going to lose to feature development, for feature development.
Right. But
maintenance load gives us another set of numbers. Look, our current maintenance load is above our set of developers based on the fact that, we've had outages the past 3 weekends. We need to get maintenance load down below the number of developers we have so the stuff's not breaking. And we need to get it significantly lower than the number of developers we have for our developers to feel fulfilled in their jobs. And if they don't feel fulfilled in their jobs, they'll leave. And businesses know how expensive it is to hire engineers. It's so expensive.
Right.
So that can be really helpful.
It seems like they almost get focused on the micro opportunity cost of like, what features is this going to prevent us, when they're missing the macro, which is like when you lose staff and getting back up. So
yeah.
Yeah. Well, we have a few more seconds or minutes here if anybody has any questions, but I just want to say, I think it's fascinating because, as an industry, we occasionally fail to realize that sometimes we need to kind of slow down and look at things, or, which is something that refactoring that immediately comes to mind. Like, that's not new work necessarily, but you need to do that in order to move faster. And I think that kind of goes in with the theme of what we have today.
Yeah, I agree.
I think that's all we have. We'll be back on the main stage in just a few minutes. Again, Chelsea, you're reachable at Hey Chelsea Troy via all sorts of social media, except for your website or your blog site, which is, remind me.
Troy.com.
Okay, great. We've really enjoyed your presentation today. This was fascinating. Thanks so much for taking some time with us today.
Of course. Everybody have a good one.
Thanks, Chelsea. Take care.
Bye.